Well, it's a great privilege to be joined today by lead pastor at Audacious Church in Manchester, England, Pastor Glyn Barrett. Glyn, how are you?
Rob, doing very, very well, thanks, mate. Yep.
How's 2020 been for you so far?
Well, we've tried to reboot it a few times. There was that meme that came out that says, can we unplug it and plug it back in again? So I think it's definitely a year of adaptation and innovation for every leader, isn't it? So, yeah.
How have you, just general observations, how do you feel the church is doing? Obviously, the pandemic hit us out of nowhere, but then we've had the racial tensions and issues of prejudice over the past few weeks. I mean, as a leader, like what are you seeing in terms of the church's response as a whole?
I think what's been really good for the church globally is the recognition and realization that actually the church is bigger than a building or a liturgy or formalized structures that we've had in place. Ultimately Jesus said he would build his church. And I think that the danger of pastors, myself included, is that we can think at times that we are building the church. And so we read lots of books on building church, how to have healthy teams, how to have great programs that encompass a lot of people groups and community outreach and things like that. And none of them have been done away with during this time, but there's a real confidence that actually God knows what's going on behind the scenes, and he is continually building his church through this season. So I've been really impressed that churches have been adaptable and innovative during this season. There's probably been more adaptation than innovation, I think. But I think that if you get into the spirit of adaptation, then you can move into becoming more innovative in terms of your leadership approach. And so it's felt to me that the church has responded pretty well during what is unprecedented season, really.
Brilliant. And obviously some people being introduced to you now and you're a senior pastor of a very large church, but it'd be great to rewind a little bit and you just share a little bit about where you come from, how you've been led to where you are now. It'd be great to get a bit of context about you.
Sure. Well, my accent's Australian, but I'm English born. So I'm born in Manchester, actually. My dad was a pastor. Mum and dad are from the valleys of South Wales and travelled around during their ministry life. Came to Manchester. I was born. And then when I was 2, my family relocated to Australia. So raised in country Queensland in Australia. I'm a dual British Australian citizen.
Great.
And then at the age of 15, moved back to Manchester. So my dad was pastoring in the suburbs of Manchester when I was 15. He said to me, you're going to have to be the youth pastor and you're going to have to join the band. And I said, Dad, I don't play an instrument. He said, well, you got 6 days to learn. So he bought me a guitar. I learned G, C, and D. And the next week I was involved in leading worship and part of the church band per se. And then youth pastoring at the age of 15 because, Dad needed somebody who he knew and was confident in. So kind of really got thrust into it at the age of 15. When I was 20, I went back to Australia to go to the Theological Bible College for Assemblies of God in Australia, which is now called Australian Christian Churches. Did 4 years in Australia, met my wife, who is first-generation Australian but Latin American from Chile. We got married, had a 2-month honeymoon, and then 24 years ago, moved back to England, where we were youth pastors in Sheffield for 12 years. And during that time, really felt a desire to come back to my home city of Manchester to launch a city-shaking, city-influencing church. And so, just over 12 years ago now, our pastor released us. And 12 years ago, we moved to Manchester, launched Audacious Church, which has 3 locations now in Manchester, 1 in Chester, 4,000 adults plus in attendance. Pre-COVID, we'll see what it looks like post-COVID. So that's the journey that we've been on. And I've been the national leader of Assemblies of God in Great Britain for 1 year.
Yes, I wanted to say that. I didn't mention that in the introduction, but you're obviously head up National Assemblies of God. And so it bleeds nicely into my next question, because people will perhaps get a snapshot of all you're doing, leading a church of thousands, heading up a national movement. And they'll be wondering, is leadership an innate gift, or is it something that has to be developed, or is it both? Because obviously you were thrown in at the deep end with your father trusting you and giving you that responsibility. Have you looked at leaders and thought, yeah, you're clearly just a born leader, or actually have you grown into that?
I definitely think it's both. I do think that in a house like the house I grew up in, there's that sense where Joshua said in the Bible, "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." So I do think there is something to do with a family context of anointing, calling, and gifting that is sort of innate within a person. But I don't think you're born a leader. I do think it's something that you definitely have to develop, skills that you need to grow in and learn. So, I'm currently studying a Master's of Leadership. I'm 3 years into that because, I'm more acutely aware of my failings as a leader than anybody else is. And so there's definitely a sense of calling, family context, and a journey of self-leadership and study that every individual has to go on as a leader. But there is that sense as well where the ascension giftings of leadership calling, if we can use that, is something that where God puts his hand on a man and a woman to be involved in that context. And so I do think there's really a sense of having a growing awareness of what we're called to be, what the purposes of God look like in our own lifestyle. So that mixed tension of both born and growing into it are both very, very key. It's a tension for sure.
So good. So attention to be managed rather than like a problem to be solved.
Yeah, I think so. I do think that sometimes in altar calls, I'm a second generation Pentecostal or spirit empowered, Christian leader. That sometimes we go to altar calls for things that we can't change. So, for example, if God's put his hand on us for something, then we should really, in a sense, be going to the altar call in context with what God's put his hand on us for, not for the things that we can't change, if you know what I mean.
So good. And you've experienced a lot of stuff. I mean, I don't know when it was now. I actually first saw you, I think you were doing the giving message at Hillsong Conference at the O2 Arena, delivered an amazing, I think it was like 7-minute giving message, phenomenal. But you've not just been offered like experiences, but you've also must have been exposed to so many great leaders over the years. So in your opinion, based on your observations, what's the difference between like a good leader and a great leader?
Yeah, brilliant. A good leader is someone who you look at and I think you're impressed by. You're impressed by the fruit of their life. You're impressed by, their personality, their charisma, their skill set in whether it be preaching, standing in front of masses, or standing in front of a small group to impart. I think a good leader you look at and go, yep, they're great. A great leader is someone who inspires you to the sense of saying, gosh, if they can do it, I can do it too. A great leader is someone who in a massive room makes you feel like you're important too, wherever you're seated in that arena, in that auditorium. And so for me, it's very much a personal thing. Good leaders, they're great. Great leaders make me feel like I can be great. And I think that's such an important thing. That's why I think leadership is less about information and more about an impartation from spirit to spirit.
Beautiful.
A really great leader imparts something of their spirit into your spirit that brings a connectivity. So many of the world's great Christian leaders are great because you feel like you personally know them, but you may never have met them.
Wow.
I think that's a lot of great leadership.
That's an amazing answer. So how do you live by priorities and not by pressures? As John Maxwell says, walking slowly through the crowd. How can you do that, particularly on a Sunday when you're carrying vision, you're carrying strategy, you're wanting to make sure everything's excellent, wanting to make sure your teams are mobile and doing great things? How do you intentionally slow down and choose to walk through the crowd?
Well, I do think that there's really a sense of remembering and reminding yourself continually what you have been called to do. So first and foremost, I am a local church pastor.
Yeah.
And I think for me, as church got larger and larger, I began to realize that I couldn't give myself to people the way I used to. You know,
Yeah.
my door was open 24/7, et cetera, et cetera. But to use the illustration that John Maxwell said, it's so important that I realized that I actually do a lot of my pastoring in the foyer, in the lobby of the church on a Sunday, you know, pre-COVID, of course. And
Yeah.
so whenever I'm not with a guest, if I'm not with a guest on a Sunday, a guest speaker, I will always be in the foyer, always on the front doors of church, welcoming people into church. You know, I am a tactile leader, so this COVID experience of not being able to touch and hug is a huge deal for me personally. But you know, I hug people, I talk to people, and really, as much as possible, try to get the feel of what's taking place within the life of the individuals in our church through the time in the foyer. So for me, the foyer is probably one of the most important elements of what we do on a Sunday. And of course, I think as well, pressure in leadership goes with the territory, because in whatever capacity you're a leader, every single person really wants you to become a champion for their cause. And so, you know, of course, there are so many different causes that we can give our lives to. And I think that one of the problems with giving your life to another person's cause is that where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
And I think that then what you represent ends up being like a pendulum. You have a church or a ministry that swings from one cause to another cause to another cause, and nobody really knows who they are or what they're coming to or what they're a part of.
So good.
So I think in that context, that's where what Paul says to Timothy is so important. He says to instruct people in a sound pattern of teaching. So in order to instruct people in a sound pattern of teaching, that's why it's really important for you, for me as a leader, to know who we are, to know what the agenda is for God's plan for our life and the ministry we represent, and to slowly walk that journey. And when new pressures, new expectations, new causes come, I think that's the time that you create roundtables, or we call it circles of leadership, where people can discuss and can evaluate the need to speak into those causes and to have those causes represented from the local ministry that we represent. But meanwhile, me as a local church pastor, I'm staying on this main agenda that, you know, incorporates really what God spoke to us about 13 years ago before we launched the church. And then these new things as they arise get incorporated, but they don't distract the leader.
That's brilliant, because I was going to ask you, as a leader, how do you respond rather than react? Because there's so much stuff being thrown at you constantly. So is it being grounded in your vision and knowing your calling that enables you to step back from a situation and be like, yeah, that's important, but it's not urgent? Do you have a framework or a system you use to streamline all that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in the early years of Audacious Church, and again, we're only 12 years old, but even in those early days, you know, crisis situations would arise, which were situations that were under the surface the whole time, but a crisis meant that there was a lot of heat and emotion and angst associated with it. And so, you know, we see everything that's taking place right now in the light of George Floyd, and the tragedy associated with that, which is a really, you know, racism we know is an evil, it's a sin. And yet there's a sense where it's always been around, but this situation has brought the heat and the emotion to the surface. And therefore the mechanisms to respond are really, really important during those times. If we go back 3 years ago in the history of Manchester, we had the bombing that took place at the Ariana Grande concert. And that is on our block in our city, in the city centre where our church is.
Wow.
And so, you know, through the whole period of the last 12 years, there have been these crisis, emotional, heat-filled moments that have required us to roll out a mechanism to be able to deal with those moments, because they're real, they're urgent, they need a pastoral and theological and practical response. But we still stay on the agenda of what God has called us to, which is inclusive of responding to a bombing, inclusive of responding to the George Floyd and racism and diversity conversation, but they become part of what the journey that we're already on. So absolutely, I think every church pastor and leader needs to create the mechanisms and principles that can be rolled out in different moments and seasons.
A lot of this seems to stem from great self-leadership. So I'm sure you have your days that aren't as great as others, but talk me through your kind of self-leadership and productivity. It'd be great to get behind the curtain a bit and just hear about how you structure your day, or like some of your challenges as you try and navigate your way through that.
Yeah, great question, Rob. I think firstly, routine is everything. So, to a life without routine, I know routine works best for some personality types, but I find that with routine, it just gets me into a really good habit of behavior that really helps me in future moments of potential stress or anxiety or whatever.
Yeah.
So for me, looking at the 7-day week, Sunday for me has always been the first day of the week. Give God the first. And so, my Apple diary says Monday's the first day. It's wrong. Sunday's my first day.
Yeah.
And then Monday, for the last 24 years for me has been a day off, a day of rest. And so I start the week with the day of rest. But, when it comes into the working week, what I tend to do is my daily routine is an early morning start, which will involve my quiet time devotions in the morning. I'm now 8 years into reading the Bible through with Matthew Henry's commentaries.
Wow.
So I'm currently in the book of Habakkuk. I'm in Habakkuk chapter 3 at the moment. And what I'll do is I'll read a section, read some verses. I'll ask myself some questions. I'll put some thought into it. And then I'll read Matthew Henry's commentaries. I'll contrast and compare his notes with mine. So I've gone all the way through from Genesis to Habakkuk 3. I'm also in Revelation chapter 3, having done Matthew all the way through to Revelation chapter 3. So I've probably got about another year or so left in me of doing that. And that's a daily thing that I do.
All right.
And that's not to write a sermon. That's just for my benefit, because, the word of God I find is so compelling and so gripping. So that happens every morning. And then on the back of that, depending on which day will determine which meetings I will have. So Tuesday is very much a local church day from morning to night. Staff conversations, strategy, leadership decisions, conversations. Thursday is an all-day Assemblies of God day, where I'm dealing with everything associated with the movement of churches that I belong to. Wednesday is my personal preparation or personal study day. So that's always devoted to my personal study. Again, not sermon preparation or anything like that. Friday is my sermon prep day. And so I could have anything from 2, 3, 4 messages on a go at any given time. Wow. Saturday is a family day, and then back into Sunday. So that's pretty much the routine that I've lived with, especially for the last 8 years.
Amazing. And there's clear pattern in that communication. I wanted to land on this really in the interview, because you're a great communicator. And I think oftentimes we look at great communicators and we don't understand the work that's actually gone in behind the scenes to get them that good. I'm sure naturally you have that ability, but I'm sure you also, you just said that you work on it. So could you share, if you were doing a communication seminar now with our viewers or with a group of pastors and leaders, kind of what would you say to them that the non-negotiables, you really need to know this stuff?
Oh, that's brilliant. So homiletics, the art of sermon construction is a really important subject that I think every preacher, every vicar, every minister, every pastor really needs to kind of go on the journey of studying homiletics. Communication is an art form. It is something that I think every public speaker really needs to develop. And you don't just develop it through experience, you develop it through being intentional. And so there would be probably 11 different styles of preaching that I would think every preacher would need to explore and look at.
Wow.
For example, you have, I would naturally be more an illustrative communicator. And so the art of storytelling. And yet one of the things that I became really aware of in the early days of planting Audacious Church was that I needed to give more than story. I needed to anchor a lot more of the subject material into textual conversations, biographical conversations, and those styles of preaching, expository preaching as well. And so I do think that the 11 styles of preaching are non-negotiables. because you're going to find that at different times you're going to have to require on a different type of message to anchor the truth that you're trying to convey. I would definitely look at that. I think secondly, my big thing would be for every preacher to and this is a personal thing, Rob, and I know that whoever's going to watch this, as many people would disagree with what I'm about to say as agree, but there's a very big difference, I think, between a Sunday talk and a Sunday preach. I think that what we're doing right now is we're talking with each other.
Yeah.
But I think preaching is a very different thing. And when you look at what the Bible says is preaching, kerugma, the outrush of the soul, there's an impartation from spirit to spirit, which in a sense bypasses mind to mind. Now, I'm not saying that we dumb down our conversations to the point that it doesn't elicit, good thinking and better thinking, because we are transformed by the renewing of our mind. But ultimately, preaching is an impartation.
Yeah.
And so I think there is that sense where, the great preacher of old said, I'm going to stand on a platform, I'm going to burn and be on fire, and people can come and watch me burn. So preaching should be more than just a topical conversation, and more of an impartation, an outrush from spirit to spirit, that Rob is able to leave a message that he hears Glyn speak, and at times say, something happened. I don't even know what happened, but I just feel different. That's because it's an impartation. It's the tripart nature of mankind, of humankind, spirit to spirit. Of course, soul and body are involved in there as well, but I think that's important. So preachers out there, get on fire before you preach. Love what you're about to preach. Know what you're about to preach. Internalize what you're about to preach. Because I think that sometimes we can fall into the trap of having a greater relationship with our notes on a lectern than with the people that we're trying to communicate the message to.
Wow. That's
so
great answer.
The difference between a lecture and a preach, I think, are very key within this. And I guess lastly, I'd say this is depending on the breakdown of the people that you're speaking to. For me, in a church on a Sunday, if a 16-year-old can walk out of the service and say, gosh, I got that, then for me, that's the win. Because on a Sunday, I'm not trying to run a major discipleship class or a Bible college lecture.
No.
What I'm trying to do is whet people's appetites for more. So the discipleship conversations really happen in either our Bible colleges, our online Bible college, our small groups, our departments, whereby in a sense, the introductory subject covered on a Sunday can then be broken down and, assimilated through the life of the church in other different contexts.
Such an amazing answer. Wow. I want to know where you fall on this question. I've asked this, I've gone across the spectrum. So we've asked TD Jakes this, John Maxwell this, Judah Smith this, last night, Sam Rodriguez this question, and there's no universal answer. And the question is, do you listen to other preachers? And if you do, who do you listen to? Because some say, no, I don't listen to any. I just focus on my voice, what God's saying to me. And others are like, no, I'm gleaning all the time because I want to get better and see what's out there. Like, where do you fall on the kind of spectrum?
Well, listen, you're not going to like this because I'm and/or. It genuinely depends on the season.
Yeah.
So I will have a season where I will sit and I will listen and I'll absorb what I think some of the great communicators, preachers of the world are preaching. And as much as listening to what they're saying, I'm as much trying to listen to how they say it. So, I'm not just taking notes in terms of the content of the message, but how have they crafted that? How have they put that? How have they taken that theological tension and made it something that lands and is understandable in a 2020 year mindset? Because obviously the seasons change. So, for example, the young generation coming through now are very justice driven. There's almost a sense where a lot of the conversation associated with George Floyd right now, the rightness and wrongness of it, is coming from a generation that sees right and wrong and lives with a sense of absolutes. Whereas I'm a Gen Xer. Gen Xers lived with there's no absolutes. Everything is kind of relative. And so the problem with a Gen X preacher is we can preach like everything's relative, but the young generation is actually wanting the absolutes of the right and the wrong. And so I want to know how are preachers out there actually communicating a message to a generation coming up that has these absolutes, rights and wrongs. So I'm very seasonal. You know, Bishop Jakes, you know, of course, how can you not, as a preacher, want to listen to Bishop Jakes and realize that that man can craft the Bible in a way that not many people can. You know, and I think that, you know, I listen to Jakes, I listen to, Pastor Russell Evans, Planet Shakers Australia, because he is an impartation preacher, you know, and then I love the way, you know, for example, Pastor Brian Houston takes complex scriptures and makes it simple for people to go, oh my gosh, that is, you know, he's taken something profound and made it something so understandable to this generation. So in seasons, that's how I would navigate those.
Amazing, Glyn. That's going to help loads of people. Penultimate question before we wrap up. How do you think, well, I guess it's twofold the question. First and foremost, what do you think things are going to look like for the church when it's almost an impossible question to ask, but what do you think is going to happen as we come out of lockdown with the church in the UK? And second part is, how do you discern what you pick up from where you left off? There'll be people who have been had building projects, or they were growing in numbers, and now they're not sure whether to put it on hold or whether to move forward. Like, how do you discern the demands of what's ahead?
So life post-COVID will be definitely different to pre-COVID. There is a sense, and I guess it's become a cliche, that you know, there is going to be a new normal. So people would say right now, I'm looking forward to going back to normal. The question is this: what normal do you want to go back to? Because I think what this lockdown season has done is it's given us a chance to really reevaluate priorities in our life. And I think naturally what happens is as we go through life, it's like with your house. You reach a moment in your house where you think, oh man, how did I get so much stuff in the house? It's because you attract things and you add things to your life as you go. I think right now it's so important for every pastor, every leader of every ministry to think, okay, why did we start off in the first place? What were our priorities? Why have we added all these things to our life? So I do think that post-COVID, life's going to look a lot simpler for a lot of people, because people have, society's got used to some of the simplicity of the lockdown world. We're at home, we're with family, we're on Zoom. Oh, you mean now I've got to go back to a church building and I've got to go back out? So I do think that simplicity is going to be key. I do think as well that from a church context, we've got to be aware of the need to stay digital, and not just digital live from the auditorium, but think, how do we do our live experience in our buildings, as well as create an online experience that is not too dissimilar from what our online audience got used to during the period of lockdown. You know, this concept of being digital with geographic locations, or are we geographic with digital locations? I think that's a genuine sense of tension that pastors are going to have to get to the bottom of in their own local context. I think when it comes to building programs and things like that, Rob, that ultimately we've got to fall back on what do we believe God has tried to achieve during this season, and did God know this season was coming our way? So as a local church, you know, we are really in the beginning stages in terms of we've got the planning, got the architect's drawings done up and ready to press go on a £35 million cathedral that we're building in Manchester City Centre. And the reality is that a lockdown like this came at a really good time for us in terms of our planning and our thinking and our budgeting exercises for how we're going to build the new cathedral. So I wouldn't suggest that pastors and leaders in building phases out there stop what they're doing, but genuinely take the space to really reevaluate what the building process will look like. So as an example, we were going to build one standalone cathedral that was going to have all the bells and whistles of everything you would want a modern day cathedral to house: a multi-story car park, 500 cars, you know, an auditorium for 2,500 seats, a minor hall of 1,000 seats, lots of classrooms, indoor adventure play center, restaurants, cafes, wellbeing center, all those sorts of things as one building. But actually what COVID's helped us to realize is rather than build it as one building, we're going to build this thing in phases. we're going to add on new parts of the building as we go, so that we can scale the building to the comfort of the finance in the bank, and not over borrow based on potential funds through conferencing and through commercial hire, which we know has been non-existent for the last 3 months. So I think it's a reevaluation of things, as opposed to don't do it. Just rethink the process with which you're going to achieve these things.
That was really wise. On that, what's the one thing? There'll be many things that our viewers don't know that in this season you think they should know. As a final question, Glyn, what would you say to someone who's sitting across a table from you, having a coffee, asking for your wisdom during this time?
One of my key verses, I think that is more real now than ever before, in John chapter 5, where Jesus says, I only do what I see my Father in heaven doing. And I think that whilst conversations and interviews and podcasts and online church is so brilliant and so critical and crucial right now, probably the most important thing that we can do as leaders, as Christians, is get on our knees before God and say, Lord, what are you saying? So Jesus only did what he saw his Father in heaven doing. So my advice would be this: do what Jesus did. See it in heaven and copy it on earth. Because actually the blueprint for your life is not going to be found in the blueprint of another person's life. There may be things that you can add here and there, but God has got a unique calling and a unique path for every single viewer watching this right now. So see it in heaven, copy it on earth, and you'll see an acceleration of the blessing, the favor of God, and the fruit of God into your life, because you're not a copy, you're actually original based on what you saw in heaven.
I love that. That's quite prophetic. Amazing. Thank you, Glyn. Well, thank you for pouring into us the last half hour.
Thanks.
Pray you remain safe and sane in the final few weeks of lockdown.
And you too.
And speak to you again. Thank you.